Live everywhere.
Daily Co's Radio on netrootsradio.com presents
David Walton. Kagro in the Morning Show. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is Wednesday, December 27th, 2017, and we are back on the air with some live shows today. Greg Dworkin standing by in a freezing cold Connecticut. We're just keeping him outside to make sure he's fresh through the holidays. And he'll join us and update us on the latest in the headlines, because I don't know, because I was at a place where there were no newspapers and terrible internet. So I don't know what happened. All right, I know a little bit about what happened because I watched it happen on Twitter, as I usually do. Let's see, everything a little bit upside down today at the world headquarters, which we've turned into a tuberculosis ward, by the way. A little bit of, I don't know what kind of nasal drip situation happening over here, but nearby, I keep him close by so that he's handy. I've kept a young child with a cough, and, well, the computer that he plays his games on is real close to Kagro in the Morning World headquarters. There's really not a lot of room in Kagro in the Morning World headquarters, so occasionally we'll punctuate our stories with some throat-clearing coughs, because everyone loves to have that happen. I feel like I can't send him away, right? He needs to, it's vacation time, the kids are off from school, and by God, if they want to cough in your ear, well, that's what's going to happen. And that's what it's like to have kids at home. So anyway, we'll try and do our best to work around that. Maybe Greg has some suggestions about what we can tape to our front door for this particular cold. And we'll poke around and get a few stories to share with the rest of you. Everything, as I said, upside down here, not just because of kids being at home, but for whatever reason, everything is on the main controller computer, as it were, is sort of out of whack here, and we're gonna have to work on the screen display. Everything's working fine, but my apps are opening up like halfway off the screen, and I'm having to search around and close all the windows in order to find the apps I'm looking for, which is a little bit distracting, but not horrible. Anyway, lots of stories in pocket, lots of stories coming over the wire from Greg via Skype. I can see already how cold it is there. I think he was burr and freezing just a few minutes ago here. What did you say, 12 degrees, something like that? All right, well, it's pretty rough out there. Winter weather finally arriving. It's been a little warm, like around the world, basically, for a long time, like 50 years now. And, well, we're just slipping into the winter weather here. We might get a little trace of snow here in the Northern Virginia area, but nothing to be concerned about. And besides which, I don't have a full weather report for you, so there's very little point in going over those details. Lots of stories collected this morning, lots of Twitter activity. Bill in Portland, Maine, where it's even colder, I assume, than it is here, starts us off with a morning tweet, and more than just the morning tweet for Daily Coast Radio. Another fine entry into the roundup of stories we'll have to cover today. But first, Daily Coast Radio is live now. Kagro X, that's me. Hi, how are you? Is back to spread post-holiday cheer, with an assist from Greg Dworkin, Dem from Connecticut, on Twitter. By the way, I don't say his Twitter handle nearly often enough. There we go. There's the background coughing. Now that I've pointed it out for you, you'll never miss a single one, just like I don't. It's like the Wilhelm scream, if you will. But, yeah, Dem from Connecticut. That's Democrat from Connecticut. CT, the postal code, in case you have been listening to the show for years and have somehow not figured out where to find Greg on Twitter. I don't think that that's a large number of people, but just in case. But, yes, with holiday cheer spreading, post-holiday cheer spreading, although it's still holidays. New Year's Eve is still a holiday. Because, yes, the libtards won the war on Christmas this year. Finally. We've extinguished Christmas. Yeah, I mean, wow. Trump spent his last couple of days insisting that, he fixed everything, and now we're able to say Christmas again. And, of course, the newspapers played along. It was a big point of controversy over the break, as it were. That was it the Washington Post ran yet another of the stories of let's go talk to Trump supporters about how they still support Trump. Wow, it's so surprising. They were illogical and disconnected from reality before, and now they still are. How odd is that? This one had the hook that they were going to talk to people in the town that never stopped saying Merry Christmas, which of course leads me to wonder, what is it that they're grateful to Trump for bringing back Merry Christmas for if they never well, they're just looking out for the rest of us, I guess. But in addition to that, Bill also tweeted around a graphic which has got a lot of interest, catching a lot of eyes this morning, from the Daily Edge, which I've seen before, although I don't know, have we ever read a Daily Edge? Is there a Daily Edge story? I don't even know what the Daily Edge is. Anyway, they had a nice graphic. Laziest president ever was their comment on it. I don't know whose graphic it was, but they grabbed it, and it was a visualization of presidential travel time, vacations, which they put in scare quotes, during the first year. And to no one's surprise, of course, Donald Trump, far and away the leader in that category. But it's also worth pointing out, as Bill did, that he's the laziest president ever, and he represents the laziest party ever. They used, of course, red and blue graph entries, the bars in the bar graphs, to identify which party these presidents were from. And as it turns out, well, basically no Democratic president even approaches the lowest numbers among Republican presidents. I guess they're just different sorts of people, really. And I do explain it this way. I guess the more vacation properties you own, I think the greater the tendency to spend vacation time at all. And, of course, to spend it at those properties. Trump, of course, coming from nominally the vacation property business, it should not surprise you that he's taken by far the most vacation. But it says here on the graph here, 111 days during the first year. And, of course, we haven't hit the first year mark yet. We're actually about a month short of his first year in office. That won't happen until January 20th. So he's got time, and looks like he's on track to hit 120 days. Reminder, there are 365 of them in total in a year and a quarter, if you want to include that. And, wow, not much surprise, I guess, that he would be the laziest, but talk about shattering your records. And it's cold enough to shatter almost anything, I understand, up in Connecticut. Greg Dworkin is here to say exactly that, and probably a little more. Good morning, Greg.
Good morning. I didn't really want to talk to you. I just like the calling music, so I was just dialing in to hear it for a little bit.
Oh, well, that's fine.
It's kind of a catchy tune. It gets in your head, and it's an earwig, and then you can't get rid of it.
Yeah, well, we should. I wonder if there's any way to. I guess you could record it and put it on a loop and just play it. It'll cover up the coughing in the background anyway.
Yeah, and also I could just do that as my segment.
Yeah. Okay. Excellent. Do you actually have any?
Do I have
stories?
to? Yeah, I have stuff.
Okay.
You know what I want to talk about? I want to talk about polling a little bit, but I also want to talk about Orrin Hatch.
Orrin Hatch. Okay.
Orrin Hatch.
He's, I think, one of the top
you know about Orrin Hatch?
Yes.
I mean, you've been away, you've been on vacation and all that sort of stuff, Christmas and bah humbug and all that.
Twitter makes it impossible to really.
You heard about what happened with Orrin Hatch?
I did. Congratulations, Orrin. He thinks
right, basically, and I lead this off with the pundit roundup, but Utah's biggest paper says that Orrin Hatch sucks at his job. He should retire. He's a disaster and a disgrace. And actually what they said, this is a Salt Lake Tribune editorial, why Orrin Hatch is Utahn of the year. That's UTAHN. Alabamians will recognize the use of the state built into your what you call people. And New Yorkers, will do the same. Here in Connecticut, nutmeggers do it differently. But, anyway, what the editorial said was it has everything to do with recognizing, one, Hatch's part in the dramatic dismantling of the Bears' Ears and Grand Staircase Escalante National Monuments. Two, his role as chairman of the Senate Finance Committee in passing a major overhaul of the nation's tax code. And three, and this is the one I like, his utter lack of integrity that rises from his unquenchable thirst for power.
My. That is.
I mean, that was pretty clear, right?
Yeah.
It happens to be Republicans everywhere. See gerrymandering, see voter ID, see suppression, see ridiculous voting commission, see the way they conduct business in Congress. That's a cold fact. That's what I wrote in the Pundit Roundup today.
Aha.
But anyway, the Tribune editorial said that. So what does Hatch do? Hatch tweets out something along the lines of tweeting the front page of the paper and thanking them for the honor.
Thank you. All it says there is he's
Right.
Utah of the Year.
So that led to comments, multiple comments, too many to mention. But here's a example of one. Gene Weingarten writes, "This is spectacular. Orrin Hatch's RT'd this article naming him Utah of the Year, thanking them for the honor. As with the tax bill, he obviously never read it." And so, basically all of Twitter was making fun of Orrin Hatch for not reading things that he does, things that he passes around, and of course not reading the stupid tax bill that he was,
Right.
part of writing, because don't forget there was all this stuff that nobody knows how it got in there.
Yes, that's true. He didn't, and he deserves the honor. He should get rid of that I in his name too, and just be
And it seems like a silly thing to focus on with what else is going on in the world.
Yeah.
But my point is that I think that the newspapers spend way too much time. Thank goodness the Salt Lake Tribune took care of this. But I think other outlets spend way too much time treating him as a very serious person and not enough time ridiculing him and not ridiculing the other Republicans in Congress. Sure. And instead of pretending that this is all like normal, I think they should make fun of them all the time. I mean, The Onion is the best news source in the country right now because what they write, as silly as it is, turns out to be true more times than not.
Yeah, eventually it does. Of course,
not
they're
even
trying
eventually
to push,
sometimes.
Yeah, they're trying to push the boundaries. Oh, certainly the news could never get this. Oh, well, look at that, it did. They ought to do that, and the Salt Lake Tribune ought to do things like have headlines that say, "Orrin Hatch sucks." And it just,
right, and exactly. And let's talk a little bit about politicians and how much they actually do suck.
Okay.
And it's amazing that there isn't more of this. Did you know, for example, that Paul Ryan is getting challenged not just by Randy Bryce, Iron Stash, the Democrat going to be running against him,
Yes.
but he's actually being primaried.
I have seen that, which I assume is a lunatic, but I'm not sure.
Complete lunatic. His name is Paul Nehlen, Nehlen. He's a protege of Steve Bannon. He's a white nationalist who tweets things like, it's okay to be white, it's perfectly reasonable to be white, and all the Jews who say otherwise are crazy.
I mean,
This is the guy
okay.
that's running
You
against
don't say things like that.
Paul Ryan, and he just says all this stuff out loud.
All right.
Here's a piece from the Harvard. It's called "Meet the White Nationalist Who Wants to Replace House Speaker Paul Ryan."
Oh, that guy.
It's accepted and not a huge big deal that the Republican Party is sponsoring. I mean, sure, they're supporting Ryan and not this guy, but he's in the party. He's running.
Yes.
He's a Bannonite, and he's a Nazi.
Whoops.
And no big deal. Nobody even talks about it.
Yeah. Well, we're
I think it's a big deal. I don't like Nazis.
Oh, noted. I mean, I don't either. Yeah, it's probably a little surprising for the rest of the world, and I assume a little more surprising for Israel than most of the rest of the world.
Again, let's talk politics a little bit. Did you know that there was going to be, this being Wednesday, there was going to be a settling down of exactly who won that Virginia House seat.
Oh, well, yes, there was
But
to
it's
be
not.
a resolution.
It's not going to happen today.
Good. It's very cold.
Yeah, it's too cold to do that. They were supposed to open up the film canisters. Maybe they got, covered with ice and they couldn't do that.
That's it.
But the main reason it's happening is, and this is kind of weird and sort of I don't have the whole story here to lay out for your listeners, but absolutely a process thing.
Oh, yeah.
What happened is that the Democrat who had won by one vote, then after it was accepted that she had won by one vote, a vote was challenged.
Yes.
And that vote was awarded to her opponent. And so now it's a tie. And that's why they're going to pick the name out of a film canister mechanism.
Yes.
However,
As a manner of speaking. Yes.
She's challenging that in court.
She's
challenging the ballot.
Yes. Challenging, I think, a lot of things. But chiefly, yeah. Do you have a story on the challenge that she's, or you're just bringing us?
Because she filed a lawsuit.
Yeah.
The group who gets to pick the film canister, which is, I guess, the same people who do the Oscars, decided that they're not doing it until this is settled.
Well, they did ask. I saw yesterday a letter from the attorneys representing her in this court challenge, asking that since the mechanism has no deadline, there's no rule in the or no law, no controlling legal authority on when they have to do the drawing. They said you might as well just suspend it and let us hash this out in court and see whether we can moot the whole drawing. You don't want to do the coin toss / film canister draw and then find out that was unnecessary and it's unnecessary and stupid and invalid looking on its face anyway. So if you can avoid it, you probably should. So yeah, that's where we stand. I did see a little bit about what the challenge was about, but I don't have an article to read, but I'll perhaps share that later on. See if I can find something during a break.
Things are so fast moving, though.
Yeah.
It's even hard to know exactly what the specific issue is, but I could tell you for right now that drawing is not taking place today. And here's an interesting piece in the Washington Post, which led me to this whole discussion. Could a split Virginia House force delegates to get along? It's happened before.
Okay.
What happens if Republicans hang on to a 51-49 advantage? It's interesting because when they thought it was 50-50 before this challenge, before the one ballot was awarded to make it an exact tie in the election,
yes,
which didn't make it an exact tie in the House split. But when it was felt that the Democrat had won the election and therefore was a 50-50 House split, the GOP leadership was making all sorts of noise about how you got to get along and we'll work this out and it's great and comity and we all love each other and all this. But what happens if the Republicans hang on to a 51-49 advantage?
Aha.
On that, the party's been quiet. Who's get to be speaker? The majority leader, who was in line to be speaker, declined to comment for the story. And the article points out, I mean, this is practical power politics, and it's important to review. The Republicans had a 66-34 edge before the election. They aren't going to let the hard-won advantages of power slip away easily. You'd think if it was 51-49, it would be similar to 50-50, but it won't.
Yeah. No.
Right? Control of the House affects which bills get taken up and which ones disappear.
Right, among other
Now,
things.
you might need to steer the party toward the middle on some issues. Ralph Northam had said some things about not expanding Medicaid right away, figuring out better, ways to pay for it. Cost cutting along with Medicaid is a better way. That might be something that both parties sign on to. You can do stuff like that, but whether they can work together or not, the article points out, or even agree on how to organize the operation of the House is totally up in the air. And they cite back to 1998. Okay. Over the last 20 years, there's been a real Washingtonization of politics in Virginia. Both parties increasingly have become armed camps with very few moderates in the middle of broker compromises, said Stephen Farnsworth, a political scientist at the University of Mary Washington. My guess is if there's power sharing, it'll look at least as ugly as in the past, and that was pretty ugly. So for those who don't know or recall or need to be reminded or need to learn it for the first time like me, in 1998, recently elected Republican Governor Jim Gilmore set the stage for the meltdown by plucking a handful of Democrats out of the legislature to take agency on cabinet positions,
Yes.
which is a tactic Northam has said he won't do. Republicans won the open seats. So in other words, the Democrats had the majority. Gilmore appointed Democrats. We were very savvy to this. We talked all the time about how Obama can't just, do this, or a Republican president, even Trump, can't do things like just pick off a Joe Manchin and appoint him to Secretary of Defense or whatever, because then the seat is open and the Republicans get the seat. It's a tactic. It's a known tactic, and people are wise to it now. But in those days, it was kind of,
Yeah.
So with an independent delegate agreeing to caucus with them, that created the 50-50 split, the first time Democrats had lost sole power since the 1880s. Now, the three new Republican delegates hadn't been sworn in when the Democrats convened the House to select a speaker. So, power play. They said, all right, we're going to do this before you guys take power.
Wow.
And both sides tried to gain the upper hand. Democrats used the remaining power to muscle Republicans aside and install their own speaker. The House erupted. It's hard to do something that you wish for and think you have it, and then somebody pulls it away from you, said a former Republican delegate from Fairfax.
Yes,
Old-time Democrats were desperate to keep power. Old-time Republicans were desperate to seize it. Some on both sides were horrified, and then cooler heads prevailed, and they sort of calmed down a little bit.
Huh. Well, that is very interesting. I want to read.
They give another example. You'll love this. I mean, this is like built for process people. One Democratic representative said members were afraid to get up and get a drink of water or talk to another member or go out of the room to meet a constituent. Or go to the men's room, for that matter. You were afraid somebody would push a vote when you were gone. He said he once looked on helplessly as Republicans in a committee he chaired waited until a handful of Democrats left the room, then revived the dead bill and passed it on to the full House.
I like it. I mean, I hate it.
You can do stuff like that if that's what the rules say you could do.
Yeah. Well, sometimes I think that's the way it ought to be. And it brings back there's a lot of parallels to this. I mean, you imagine how different filibusters would be if this could be the case, if absenting yourself from the floor or not speaking constantly.
I'm going to say something really ageist, okay?
Oh, all right.
Right?
Yes.
Can you imagine that the whole filibuster process and passing the tax bill or even working to repeal Obamacare was completely dependent upon which elderly Republican members had to get up and use the men's room?
Yeah, well, it'd be very different. A lot of things would be very different, of course, if we really made it dependent on what the vagaries of male biology, let's say. But yeah, it's that's why I think maybe like a talking filibuster might have been an interesting interim solution in reforming the way filibusters are conducted in the U.S.
With a trucker's friend strapped to your leg, right?
Right. You got to be there, or at the very least, you shouldn't be able to absent yourself as as the minority party. You shouldn't be able to just have one person sitting there holding up the entire works, and the rest of you can fundraise, go on vacation, whatever you want. If you want to hold the floor as the minority, you're going to have to stay there and do it. But, well, they didn't like that idea, but I think it's a good one.
Well, again, it goes back to the editorial we were talking about in terms of Orrin Hatch.
Okay.
And what I said about Republicans is true. Now, it's also true about Democrats. I don't think it's necessarily a party-specific thing. When you have power and you are entrenched and you've been there forever and you're about to lose it, things get really dicey.
They do.
Either party.
Yes. Well, power is a fun thing.
Which is why I don't expect this drawing out of a film canister to go so smooth.
No.
And it's not, and it's been challenged.
It's going to be difficult to accept for anybody, although it looked for a while like Republicans were, well, they were never really poised to accept the film canister thing. They're happy about getting it and having it rescue them from losing control.
Yeah, well, the nice thing would be if the Democrat won, then it was done, and sure, it was by a stupid way, but it's just as stupid as looking at the ballot and saying this one's okay, this one's not okay.
Yeah, and I don't know that they would have accepted it. When it looked like the recount had settled the issue and the Democrat won, I was surprised. Republicans were actually relatively calm and level-headed about saying, all right, well, here's how we'll approach things in the next session. When it looked like they might be able to reverse that, of course, they went, they reverted to form. But, then when it looked like it was going to be a drawing to decide things, they were glad to have had another shot at it, but it was pretty clear that they were not only ready to run a power play if they won, but to undermine the legitimacy of the Democrat in the seat had she won the drawing. For some reason, the vote wasn't okay for them.
So it just, interesting background. The fact that it's even up for discussion is amazing because it was, again, 66-34. But there's a huge difference between 51-49 and 50-50 when it comes to process, co-speakers, sharing power, comity, everything.
Yeah.
And, it's just interesting that people who have power do anything possible to keep it, and that's why we see the Chris Kobach Voting Commission. That's why we see voter ID to solve a problem that doesn't exist, disenfranchisement of felons, you name it. You go down the list, and it's all a big deal, and it's all designed to help prevent one party from taking power from the other party.
Yes.
And the fact that it's not acknowledged enough and that we don't work hard enough to really prevent that kind of thing And what do I mean by that? I mean by voting in non-presidential elections that they don't have a chance to do this. Voting, 2010 and 2020 and 2030 and other times that the census is going to determine how many House seats you get, things of that sort, how gerrymandering is going to happen if you happen to be in a state that is up for that. All these votes matter. And the fact that a single vote in Virginia determines this particular seat is just another example of how votes matter. So make every vote count. That's the thing. It's very hard for Democrats to say make every vote count, but we don't want to count that vote.
Yeah, there was so it's true. Ben Tribbett was doing good work in pointing out that difficulty. Although in the end, part of this challenge is, I understand it, and I'll grab an article about it, but I think the briefest way of summing up what I think is actually happening in a challenge is they said, all right, well, if you get to the point where this one ballot needs to be reconsidered because nobody's 100% sure what these markings meant. Well, there were a lot of ballots that had markings on it that we decided during the recount process how we were going to handle them. And now that we've decided to flip on this one, I think there's another dozen in there that we could be looking at. So, that's it's going to cause some
all
problems.
Good points, and that's why it's never ending. And sometimes you just have to say, okay, it's done.
Yeah. Well, we're getting near that point. Speaking of,
and yet again, another aspect of it
is
that it's interesting that Democrats are willing to play hardball for a change.
It's good, and it's not even that hardball, but I'm glad that they're going to court with it. There's no particular reason this drawing has to be done right away, and why not? Stretch it out and highlight the fact that every vote counts for as long as possible. Why not? We'll be right back after our first break. And, we'll move on from there, or maybe linger on this a little bit. You tell me, Greg. We'll be back in 2 minutes.
We'll move on. I just think it's all interesting and worth paying attention to.
Hi, it's me, David Waldman, your host for Kagro in the Morning, interrupting this little break to say thanks so much to all of you who are contributing supporters of Kagro in the Morning. Thousands of you are downloading the show each day, but fewer than 1 in 25 regular listeners are donating to help keep us on the air. For the money you'd spend on a single 3-minute iTunes song, we bring you 2 hours of great news and entertainment every day, 5 days a week. Patreon.com, Patreon.com makes it easy. You can find us there by searching KagroX or David Waldman or Kagro in the Morning or even Daily Coast Radio in their search box, and you'll be right where you need to be to make easy, recurring monthly contributions to support our show. Once again, thanks so much for your support. Welcome back to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. We are still here, standing by with Greg Dworkin, coming to us live from very cold Connecticut. Let us resume where we last left off was, some kind of disaster in Virginia. But we're going to move on to other disastrous states, as I understand it.
Well, it's always something. The whole point about the Virginia piece there is that politics never stops. If you think it's only about elections, well, there's plenty of stuff that happens in between.
Yes.
So you may remember, for example, in Mississippi,
I do not.
There was a U.S. Senate seat occupied by Thad Cochran.
Oh, yes.
And Chris McDaniel ran against him and lost.
Okay.
And McDaniel claimed there was voter fraud. McDaniel was a Tea Party or a proto-Trumpster. Trump didn't exist back in 2014 when all this happened. McDaniel is a big fan of the Sons of Confederate Veterans. I mean, basically, he's a white nationalist.
Okay.
So he's possibly going to run again.
All right. Well,
this time it would be against Roger Wicker, the other Senate Republican from Mississippi.
Any seat will do. It's not that he thought that Cochran was such a bad guy.
Right.
Okay.
So Wicker has support from Donald Trump. McDaniel's running against him and has support probably from Bannon. So it'll be another dynamic with a big fight.
Yeah. Is he a child molester?
Well, I don't know. And again, this is Republican versus Republican here. And I'm not sure where the funding is going to be. I'm not sure how well that's going to go. But it's all happening.
It's good for
and
the primary.
It's more of the Trump faction, the MAGA faction, trying to take over the Republican Party and kick out the establishment. Yeah. So this is McConnell's going to be a wicker person, and Trump is going to be reluctantly a wicker person, although his heart's probably in the McDaniel camp, and it's going to be just like Alabama.
Great. That is fantastic. If he is a child molester, that is good for the primary, but you have to pivot away from child molestation for the general.
Yeah, so that's a thing. But, it's just more indication that the Republican Party is still going through upheavals, and they're not done yet. On the Democratic side, relatively united party still you have to talk about them because Democrats in disarray. So Politico chose the particularly dumb concept here of impeachment debate divides Democrats as 2018 wave builds. We'll get to that wave in a minute. If Democrats take back the House, they'll immediately face pressure from their base to impeach Trump. But it may not be their best move. It may not even be true. They'll face pressure from the base to do proper investigation.
Right.
They
certainly
will face pressure from the base to make the House committees that Trey Gowdy and Devin Nunes and Jason Chaffetz have done properly. That is to say, not turn the other way and actually ask questions about what Trump and his cronies in his family are doing to loot the country rather than look at Uranium One and something that was written in Clinton cash and, all the nonsense the Republicans are trying to do now. That's the difference between having the House and not having the House. The Democrats get subpoena power, and they will use it. Now, if that leads to impeachment because they find high crimes and misdemeanors, so be it.
Well, what can you do?
Right? But what can you do? I mean, in sorrow rather than anger. But that's not the same thing as saying if Democrats take back the House, they'll immediately pivot to impeach, or that the base wants them to, or that's what they're going to do. That's all speculation to make a story.
Yes, although probably the most true part of it is that the base would like it. They might.
Because if that's where it takes you, that's where it takes you, and we'd be delighted if that's where the result. With the caveat that you got to also prove that Pence wasn't completely out of the loop with all this stuff. He was part and parcel of it, and he's lying about not knowing.
He's doing
but that's a different story.
Yeah.
And do the facts lead there? We have to see. That's what the investigations are all about.
Yes, they do.
So I don't think that on day one of the Democratic House you file impeachment charges. You have committee hearings, and it may take a year, and you need to bring the public and teach them exactly why this is happening and what you're doing. I don't think this is difficult, and I'm really not particularly worried that people are trying to push this too fast. The whole point about Al Green and some of the other folks bringing up impeachment charges now is that you have to make it part of the dialogue.
Yeah. Which
newspapers and the media will refuse to do unless Democrats are talking about it. And when I say Democrats, I don't mean Daily Kos and people on the internet. I mean Democratic people in Congress who have the power to vote on this thing. And so that makes it difficult for media to avoid. And so it gets the media annoyed because now we have to take it seriously.
Yeah.
But too bad for them. It's not our problem. That's their problem.
Well, there's something to think about in that. I mean, if Democrats attempt to avoid the problem, media will talk about it. It's just that the stories will be Democrats are unable to keep a lid on this crazy impeachment talk.
Well,
but if there's actual
Democrats divided, Democrats in disarray, the whole nonsense that they're just eager to do.
You might as well be talking about it. The newspapers
but that's not
are
the
print
dynamic.
It.
That's not what's going on here.
Well, it isn't. But what I'm saying is, if you at this point say, "Oh, look, there's this terrible Democrats in disarray story," the thing we need to do is hide from the topic completely and deny at every turn that we have any interest in it whatsoever. That seems to goad the press into doing they're secretly plotting this and they're divided, as opposed to, look, we'll discuss it when the time comes, and the time will come early that we'll need to look into it factually. We'll be investigating and telling what we find, and
we'll be ready.
Open to the
and so
possibility
he's not my favorite politician, but I think Mark Warner has done a service by standing up on the Senate floor and talking about the fact that their committee has seen things that are worth investigating, that there is more than smoke, that some of this is fire.
Well, yeah.
And that was covered seriously by the press. And, basically that there was nothing wrong with that. And it didn't spark backlash. The whole problem with 9/10 of the pundits out there is that they take a past lesson, apply it to the future as if it fits when it doesn't, and then draw the wrong conclusion.
Whoops.
You know, Clinton was impeached but not convicted, and there was backlash against Republicans for doing that. Therefore, you should never try to impeach somebody. That is the stupidest lesson you could possibly get from looking at what happened then. And the idea, we see it more contemporaneously with Trump won the 2016 election, therefore ignore the polls and political gravity doesn't count, completely discounting the enormous effect that Comey had on swinging what turned out to be an incredibly close election.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can't just look at that and say, well, Trump's invulnerable and none of this is going to change and his base will never move and all that sort of thing. That's just patently not true. And I got some concrete examples for you of that.
Oh. This
is a story from Mark Blumenthal, SurveyMonkey, 2017 Trump approval review, lessons from 600,000 plus interviews.
Okay.
So they went to every McDonald's in Ohio and they talked to people 97 times. Now, this is more than that. And basically, what the SurveyMonkey piece shows here is that the intensity of opinion continues to tell a potentially important story, more important story than the actual ratings here. The trend has been essentially the same as overall approval. So far in December, that's this month, better than twice as many Americans strongly disapprove, 47%, than the strongly approved, 21%, of the way Trump is handling his job as president. Only 21% of voters in a relatively Trump-friendly survey say Trump strongly approve. Okay. That is a very small fraction of the country. You don't win elections based on 21. 47% strongly disapprove. You're almost at the 50% mark of people who will never vote for this guy, who loathe him, who despise him, who will not give him the time of day, who will never vote for him, no matter what he does. Trump's strong approval rating fell by 6 percentage points in 27 to 21 between February and July, leveled off. His strong disapproval rating has been hovering near 46 since the summer, ticked up to 47% this month. And so the point there is that you erode his base at the edges, at the margins. The rally voters will never change. There's such a small percentage of the country, it doesn't matter. 21%. 21% is very evocative of the 23%, 24% in some surveys, that supported Nixon at the time of his resignation.
Mm-hmm. Yes,
that doesn't make you popular because you retain your 20% base. It's everybody else.
Yeah.
Well, I've been saying that since the election and before the election. I don't care that there are Trump voters who still like him. So what? The question is the Trump voters who didn't like him all that much to begin with or maybe loved him but don't like him now. Go interview those people. There's a lot more of them.
I am not seeing a lot of those stories. That is weird.
Well, here's one. College-educated women are moving away from Trump. Moving away from the GOP is the actual headline. Recent Wall Street Journal NBC polls, and this was in the Wall Street Journal. It's a pay-for article, but even though it's behind the paywall, the graphic that comes with it is pretty clear. Recent Wall Street Journal NBC polls show women with 4-year degrees favor Democrats over Republicans, leading Congress by 32 percentage points.
Oh, that's even.
And the graphic clearly shows that, fascinatingly, men without a college degree have moved toward the Democrats away from Republicans.
Oh.
Men without a college degree are now split between Democrats and Republicans for Congress in the generic ballot.
Okay.
And with a college degree moved from the most Republican group to looks like about D+6. Women went from slightly Republican to D+11 if you didn't have a college degree. And if you did have a college degree, and this was always the strongest Democratic group, they went from +10 Democratic to +32. And this was from 2010 to now. Over the last 7 years, all of the groups have trended toward Democrats, even men without a college degree, when it comes to the generic ballot for Congress. But the charge is being led by women with college degrees who simply had enough for Republicans. It has a lot to do with health care, has a lot to do with the tax bill, has a lot to do with who's president right at the moment, because there's been a dramatic shift since 2014 on that. But it's something that is driving the generic ballots to look like a Democratic wave. And I've seen some pretty dumb things said about this, about, how Trump can turn this around or this, that, or anything else. Trump is so unpopular. We just talked about that from the SurveyMonkey stuff, that's just not going to happen. You have the 47, 48, 49 in some surveys percent of people who loathe him. That's not changing. That's driving some of this. They're trying to blow up healthcare when people have decided they like healthcare, and don't want to lose CHIP, and they don't want to lose Obamacare. That's driving this, and that's not going to change. And so, Trump is going to have his base, but everybody else is deserting him. Now, if everybody else is deserting him, it's worth talking to them.
I guess so.
Yeah, well, we'll convince you of that eventually.
All right. Well, I'm talking now.
They've moved. If they've moved, then they're worth talking to. If you don't move, then you're not worth talking to. I'm a very practical person.
Okay. Well, they could listen if they want. How about that?
You don't have to ignore or surrender or abandon or betray your own base, including people of color, in order to get people on the margins to do this.
Well, then, okay.
And it turns out that white women with a college degree, and this survey that I was just talking about is not by color, it's women with a college degree, but these are strategically placed in suburban areas, which happens to be swing districts. So it's extremely important in Congress that this particular group of people, in fact, are repelled by Republicans and attracted to Democrats. That's what you need if you want to win Congress back, and then get to the point where you can argue about whether or not you should impeach now or next week.
Okay, I'm willing to do this. We don't have to go to – this doesn't have anything to do with soccer, right? It's not a soccer.
You mean soccer moms?
Yeah.
For security dads?
Yes. What are we going to – I mean, I think, first of all, we're moving to lacrosse.
Now, these are Me Too women.
Than soccer. Okay. All right. Well, then that's actually disastrous. I mean, sociologically speaking. Okay.
It's been a disaster. Now people are talking about it. What Anita Hill said was true. And, here it is decades later, and we're finally getting around to dealing with it.
And
now, there's a fascinating article as part of that that was in the Pundit Roundup today. I didn't put out for you there, but it's in the Pundit Roundup.
Okay.
And it is about Harvey Weinstein.
Oh, no.
And it was, I see I didn't have the link. I only had the article, so I'll have to fix that. But the Harvey Weinstein thing is in the Washington Post, and the question there is, why Weinstein?
Yeah.
Why now? How a powerful but obscure figure touched off a social movement, and it gets a lot of things right when it talks about that, and a few things wrong.
Okay, well then that's not a terrible record.
And why Weinstein? If it's too long and you didn't want to read it, it has a lot to do with the fact that the victims happen to be well-known white women.
Yes, true, right, definitely.
That is true, and that is right, and it makes people, including the media. I mean, if Gwyneth Paltrow or Ashley Judd or Angelina Jolie or Rosanna Arquette, people that are known and are not political necessarily, are going to be the victims, then you're going to read about it at the the checkout counter at the newsstands as you go past, and you read these little articles in People magazine and so on and so forth.
Right, that is true. That occurred to me when we had the Sam Seder controversy, when MSNBC fired and then reversed itself, fired him over the old tweet that Mike Cernovich had dug up, and it was about Roman Polanski, but that raises a serious question, which was, why do all the people who have just triggered this whole movement still sometimes defend Roman Polanski? Or they did, and now they might not, and that's good. That's progress and everything. But it occurred to me, I was like, well... Nobody's
defending Woody Allen. Yeah. Nobody's defending Bill Cosby.
True, and it was because he didn't... the women he victimized and children he victimized weren't famous actresses that we read about in glossy magazines at the checkout counter all the time. We were horrified by that. Oh, well, it's terrible and all child molestation, but who is she? I don't know.
Right. Yeah, and the article points out that a lot of the people that preceded Weinstein are famous only because they're victims, as opposed to famous people became victims.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
You only know who Anita Hill is because she was a victim.
That, I guess, is true. I mean, she's an accomplished professor and everything.
She is, but you wouldn't know it as a household word. Now you do, only because of this. Whereas everybody knew who,
Right. Yeah, I mean, it had a lot to
everybody
do with
knew
it.
Gwyneth Paltrow was prior to this. So that's important. The piece that it leaves out, however, is that Trump made all this possible. People were so ticked off that Trump got away with this pussy-grabbing stuff on Access Hollywood that it became untenable for Harvey Weinstein, even with all his money and lawyers and threatening, mob-like behavior, to hide this stuff. And that's left out of the article. So, I saw somebody tweet, well, if Weinstein had come before Trump, Trump never would have been elected. I think that's wrong. I think Trump being elected is what made Weinstein get public about this. Otherwise, you never heard of this guy. Even though he was incredibly powerful in the industry and doing all these things.
Yeah.
But if it weren't for Trump causing people to want to have, in a really big, bad way, a Me Too moment, then a lot of this other stuff would never have come out. Now, it might have come out later, but not now.
It's far from crystal clear, but it's an excellent point and worth considering whether it could it possibly have happened in the opposite direction. And certainly most of the rest of the purge from polite society, to the extent it's happened, and it's not enough really, to other people, other harassers and abusers, that's certainly true. And we wouldn't have seen so much additional outing of abusers. But, well, this is, it's hard to believe because you should be able to separate that from the personal politics of hating Trump. But
you can't,
some weird
because that's part of the
there.
reason why people hate Trump.
Yeah.
Don't forget, it's not the economy. The economy's doing fine. People hate Trump because of his personal characteristics. And this is one of them.
That's true.
And so let me finish up by segueing back to this whole idea of white college women deserting the GOP and women with college degrees deserting the GOP. Women as a group often favor Democrats, the article from the Wall Street Journal says, but the GOP was able to carry a slight majority of women in 2010, the year it picked up 63 House seats and regained control of the chamber. More recently, strong support for Democrats among women, and that's women of color, women who are white, have given the party double-digit leads on the question of which party should control Congress next year in several surveys this month, including CNN, Quinnipiac, Marist, and the Journal NBC News. And in fact, to remind our viewers and readers and listeners, it is plus 13 for Democrats right now, when plus 8 is enough to take the chamber. Now, here's where they actually interview people who aren't, I voted for Trump and I'm still happy. Right?
Okay.
This is why I brought this up in the first place. Mary Strasberg, a retiree with a bachelor's degree who lives in suburban Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, says she plans to vote Democratic in 2018, even though she has a long considered history and long considered herself to be a Republican. Right. She said she had grown uncomfortable with the GOP's position on immigration, among other issues. Ms. Strasberg said her daughter, a recent college graduate who lives with her because of student loan debt, had suddenly become politically engaged this year with a strong lean toward Democratic candidates and causes. She's writing Congresspeople. It began with the Women's March in January, and now it's the Me Too movement, she said. She'll be active all next year. This all ties together. It's all part of the same piece. It's why women with degrees are plus 32D, and that ain't changing.
Yeah.
And if Republicans think they can go around the country selling their tax bill as an answer to this, they're nuts.
Well, they may be nuts anyway, but that's another good indicator.
Yeah, well, even more importantly, they're finished.
Well, the Women's March was that was a huge turning point, and I guess it was so much time passed between it. I mean, well, in our hyper quick cycles now, that a news cycle being so short, it feels like so much time passed between the march and, say, the Harvey Weinstein moment, when we're trying to tie the two of them together. But I mean, it was a pretty clear thing, and it was, I suppose, clearer to the women who were marching than to some of the men who were watching exactly what was driving this thing. But if you missed the hats, guys, go back and take a look and ask yourself, what was up with all those hats? Why were they? Was it just a little signal to one another that they were united on some abstract front? No, not really. Give that a moment's thought. and realize what that, why were they marching in opposition to Donald Trump? I don't like his hair. I don't like his economic policies. He's a Republican and I'm a Democrat. No, that wasn't really it.
Well, yeah. So I'm going to leave you with that. But that's how I bring together the Harvey Weinstein thing and the Democratic wave, and I think it's all part and parcel of the same thing. Thank you, women, for being smarter than men on this, but the men seem to be coming around slowly. When I look at the men who were voting Republican and now are willing to vote Democrat, that particular percentage of them, I always think in my head is that these are the men who are actually, eventually willing to ask directions.
I guess so.
I mean, it's not all of them. But,
you see, those are the lines that actually reverse direction. Some of them bend very, that's a very hard graph to understand right off, visually anyway.
You read it from top to bottom, so you can see over the years how things change.
But, some of the things...
And we're used to reading things from, left to right.
Yes. It was a little difficult.
Or Israeli right to left.
True. Right. Also true. Okay. Well,
But with that, I'll just leave you to ponder that.
Thank you.
This is Greg Dworkin signing off for today, Wednesday, December after Christmas, someday, 12/27.
Yes.
And we'll be back tomorrow, and we'll do one more show this week with you.
Yeah, if you insist. I mean,
in the meantime, I'm going to cuddle up with someone warm and,
Well, good. Excellent.
Or maybe
good
go to
idea.
work. I don't know. I'll do one of those.
Okay.
But it's cold out here. That's all I
got
can
a
tell
film
you.
canister if you need help deciding.
Yeah.
Okay.
All righty. Take care.
Very good. Thanks, Greg. Take care. We'll see you tomorrow. Yes, today is not only Wednesday, a day on which we usually see or hear from Joan McCarter, but it is, in fact, Wednesday, December 27th. So it's going to be a day that we don't hear from Joan McCarter. It's a good day to take off. I don't know what the temperatures are like out in Idaho. I assume it's a little frigid, but it's a good day to take off. And because of as I said in the Morning Post, because of my fantastic, hugely successful tax cut, she is able to take a day off, and she should thank me because I'm the one that made it possible. The reality of the situation, of course, was a little closer to this. Joan said, I'm taking the day off, and I said, all right, and not because I'm the boss of the radio show or something, and she has to check with me. She just said, I'm just telling you, I'm not coming. I'm taking the day off. I talk to the people that actually matter with respect to approval of day offs. I'm just informing you that I'm not coming. Okay. We can handle that. Everybody gets a day off once in a while. Yes. And the 27th is a good day for it. So we look forward to hearing from Joan, I guess, in the new year. I love at the end of the year when you can do all that stuff. I never outgrew that stupid kid's trick of, see you next year when you're leaving school the week before New Year's. But, eventually I think the magic of that will wear off. All right. A couple other things that we need to catch up on. Other stories, yes, but some follow-up bits to the stories we were just reviewing with Greg. One, back to the Virginia House of Delegates race. One, I can bring you an article about a little more detail about what the challenge is. My thinking, I think I saw in passing that, and we quickly explained it, that the lawyers for the Democratic candidate in this race, the winner, actually, really, of this race, Shelley Simmons, Simons, I don't know how she pronounces her name, Simonds, essentially said, well, if you're going to reverse the ruling of the initial ruling on whether or not to count this ballot because of the way it was marked, that may be fine insofar as this particular ballot, but there were other ballots that were similarly improperly marked along the way that we disposed of one way or another. Either sometimes, I assume, deciding that it was okay to count the votes, others that it was a spoiled ballot and that the votes shouldn't be counted. But now we might have to go back through all the ballots and pull out everything in the pile of ballots that we counted, or perhaps the pile of ballots that we didn't count that are marked inappropriately, and see whether they change the outcome. Here's a an actual article on the subject from the Washington Post, which I believe will cover it. I probably should be looking down at the Richmond Times-Dispatch for reporting on this, but Google's news algorithm being what it is, it doesn't offer me Richmond readily enough for me to be able to do it on the fly on the air. But perhaps we can dig something up here. Name drawing in tied Virginia House race delayed after Democrat announces court challenge. It's Laura Vozella has written this piece. This is yesterday's Post. The Virginia State Board of Elections has postponed plans for the name drawing on Wednesday to decide the winner of that particular race. I'll try and slim things down a little bit here, cutting out the detail, the style that they give the story. Anyway, after one of the candidates, the Democrat, announced plans for a court challenge over whether the election really was a tie, the rare spectacle of filling a legislative seat by drawing one of two candidates' names out of a pitcher has drawn widespread interest, in no small part because a Democratic victory would mean that the House, where Republicans had a 16-seat majority before the November 7th elections, would be split 50-50 when the legislature convenes on January 10th. Democratic challenger Shelley Simons said on Tuesday she'd file a motion in Newport News Circuit Court on Wednesday, once again answering the question of where exactly this seat is located, asking judges to reconsider their decision to count a disputed ballot as a vote for Republican incumbent David Yancey and declare the race a tie. Let's see how much of this we can get in before the music tells us it's time to take another break. But Simons' lawyer said they could not file the motion Tuesday because the court was closed. They also said they had written to the Board of Elections asking it to postpone the name drawing until the court decides whether to act in response to the motion. So side games going on about the procedure and exactly when to kick it off because of calendar issues. We'll cover more of this when we get back from this short break. Welcome back to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. When we left off before our short break, we were in the middle of reading the Washington Post's coverage of exactly why and under what circumstances the decision on who to seat in that House of Delegates race was going to be determined by lots, by the film canister method, and why it's been postponed. The motion filed, as they said, on Wednesday, that's this morning, in the local courtrooms because the courts were closed yesterday for Boxing Day. I don't remember why we closed for that, but everyone likes to take an extra day after the big day of Christmas. And I'm not, without explaining why that's a big day or questioning why it's a big day, it just is, and people take the day off after it too. And sometimes even the day after that as well. But not for the courts. Anyway, so that's why the delay in filing until Wednesday, but that's also why they asked, let's put this drawing off. And as I explained earlier in the show, no particular reason why the drawing had to be held today. It's just that's what the election judges decided, because why not get this done as soon as possible? But the drawing could certainly be tomorrow or Friday, although Friday might be a time when people are trying to get close to knocking off for yet another holiday weekend. Anyway, so it's all been filed. Hours later, hours later after the Tuesday letter to the Board of Elections, they were closed, but it's easier to get a letter to them electronically. People open their email. Hours after the letter, the Board of Elections announced that it had canceled plans for the 11 a.m. drawing. That would have been today in about an hour from now. Drawing names is an action of last resort, the board said in a written statement. Any substantive concerns regarding the election or recount should be resolved before a random drawing is conducted. And that's a very reasonable position to take. Recognizing, essentially, that's like dressed up language for, look, we recognize that a random drawing is a dumb way to settle an election, but you got to settle it some way. And if there's no other way to settle it, then you have your random drawing. What you're saying here in your letter is there may be another way of resolving it that's based at least nominally on what we decide to do with the papers that people marked to express their voting preference. I would much rather have as difficult and time-consuming and aggravating as that process might be, it's much better to try and resolve it based on those papers people marked than by drawing a name out of a picture, even if those names are in film canisters. That is very exciting. The board, which must give 24 hours notice before calling an emergency meeting, will not hold the drawing Wednesday, even if the court rules that day. So even if the court takes up this case this morning and says, yeah, go ahead with the drawing, the board won't have the drawing right away because it's against the rules for them to call even an emergency meeting without 24 hours notice. So at the very least, as soon as if the court was to say, this is stupid, go to the drawing, you'd start a 24-hour clock there. And the board could not have that drawing, I assume, until at least 24 hours had passed between their announcement of we're going to have an emergency meeting and the beginning of that emergency meeting. So not going to happen right away. It's not going to happen today. There will be no drawing today, no matter what happens in the court. We want to act in a transparent manner, as there is no need for any more surprises with this election, the board said. On election day, Yancey appeared to beat Simons in the 94th legislative district race by 10 votes. But a December 19th recount left Simons ahead by a single vote. You remember that. The next day, a 3-judge panel decided, at the prompting of one of the Republican, I think, election observers, recount observers, who said, yes, I made the decision and agreed with the decision, or I agreed to get on board with the decision yesterday that this ballot shouldn't be counted. But then I went home and I had a bad dream, essentially, and I want this one counted again. And procedurally, that's troublesome. But I guess under the standard of we really need, whenever possible, to let the ballots do the talking, you might then say, well, it's true that procedurally you were weak yesterday and you missed your chance to go on record and object yesterday. But, you know, there do have to be line drawing exercises, too. I mean, what if this person has a bad dream next week after this is all resolved? And say, you know, there were 16 ballots that I really think should have been counted for the Democrat, whatever. And I just realized I was awfully stupid at the time that I was doing my work. And I mean, at some point you have to say, this matter is closed. If you can't, I mean, if you aren't willing to or are incapable of standing up and making an objection, even when you're not entirely sure you're right during the process, maybe you were just the wrong person for the job, and, you know, you're going to suffer for that. But, well, the judges were willing to entertain this possibility, and I guess it was close enough in time for them to say, all right, fine, let's see what you were talking about here. And they reopened the question and said, yeah, we should count this ballot. Ben Tribbett was making the point, and a few other election observers making the point, it's really difficult for Democrats who hate to resort to hypocrisy if they don't have to say to themselves, well, usually we're for let every vote be counted. We want every voice to be heard. But for some reason, you're not interested in hearing this particular one voice here that could tie the race again. On the other hand, Democrats are also, largely speaking, in favor of following the rules and the rules of law. And if this ballot is spoiled because it's an overvote, well, then it's one of the votes we can't hear the voice of. I mean, though we want every vote to count, we also know that there are some votes that aren't countable. But it was difficult to square with the idea that you should be as lenient as possible so that everybody gets a voice who can possibly have one. And it's also more to the point, I suppose. There were some election law experts pointing out that really the standards of what to do with a ballot like this may all along have indicated that it was necessary to count this vote as a vote for the Republican, to count this ballot as a vote for the Republican in this race, although I would love to know what they did, and I never did see anybody discuss this. Did they count this ballot's vote for Ed Gillespie or not? That's a good question. It doesn't affect the outcome of the gubernatorial race in any way, shape, or form, so that's why it hasn't been given any attention. But I'd love to know what they did with the oval filled in for Gillespie that also had an X through it. I mean, to my way of thinking, that's 2 slashes through it versus only 1 slash through the bubble for Shelley Simmons or Simons, or however she says it. And 2 slashes has got to be worse for you than just 1. But on the other hand, only 1 bubble filled in for the gubernatorial race. So I don't know. Anyway, but election law experts saying that if you had really followed the rules strictly, this ballot would probably originally have been counted for Yancey, and therefore, tie is where the race should be. And, and they were willing to accept it. Now, this letter from the Simons attorneys apparently raises the next question, which is, okay, so if the standard says that this thing should have been counted in a certain way, but it wasn't initially, were there other ballots that were also initially not counted or counted in a certain way that likewise need to be revisited? And if that's the case, shouldn't we postpone the drawing? It would be just too confusing to have the drawing and then find out, oh, there really was a substantive method of settling the issue based on the ballots and not a random drawing. So the judges, I think, were pretty well forced to acknowledge the wisdom of that and have since postponed the drawing. So where were we with the article? The recount, the December 19th recount, left Simons ahead by a single vote. The next day, the 3-judge panel decided that a ballot that was declared ineligible during the recount should count for Yancey, tying the race at 11,608 votes apiece, by the way. The ballot in question contained a mark for Simons as well as for Yancey, and an extra mark by Simons' name that the court ruled was an effort to strike out the mark in her favor. That is, to strike out the mark that was in her favor and vote instead in his favor, Yancey's. Republicans said the unknown voter had selected every other Republican on the ballot and intended to vote for Yancey. The panel of judges agreed. Here again, I have difficulty agreeing fully with this. Republicans said the unknown voter had selected every other Republican on the ballot. I disagree. I believe that this unknown voter did not select every other Republican on the ballot, or at least in the end decided not to cast a vote for Ed Gillespie, unless there is one other, one explanation that tenuous but makes some sense. It is interesting that the vote, the filled-in bubble, like a Scantron sheet is what we're talking about here. The filled-in bubble for Ed Gillespie has an X through it, which could mean one of two things. It could mean, oh no, I changed my mind. Don't cast that vote for him. I liked everybody on the ballot, but not Ed Gillespie. He was too Trumpian. That's a possibility. I mean, that's a possible motivation. But even if it's not the case, that she thought, or this voter thought this person was that Gillespie was too Trumpian, the X through the bubble, it could mean I changed my mind and not casting this vote. It could also mean, though, since the gubernatorial election is the first one on the ballot, sometimes people get these things and for whatever reason, they're, 80 years old and they've never filled in a Scantron sheet before, or maybe they have and they've always been terrible at it and they never read the instructions. I don't know. It's more intuitive for kids or for people of an age where they've been through standardized testing in their school career and they understand fill in the bubble. That's what you do with these things. There are directions on the ballot. There are directions all over the place. They want you to do it right, but people do it wrong all the time. This person did. They may have, there are people who think it doesn't matter what mark you make. There are people, and there's explicit instructions. Don't make X's, don't make check marks, fill in the bubble. But people all the time check a bubble or make an X over the bubbles. And they do it very often consistently throughout the ballot. But, sometimes they do things like this. The first vote they're casting is for governor. The person is voting for Gillespie. They make an X by Gillespie's name. At which point they realize, oh yes, Scantron thing. You're not supposed to make an X. You're supposed to fill in the bubble. Okay, I'll fill in the bubble. Now, a smart person at that point realizes there's every likelihood that this ballot will now be considered spoiled, and you have to go to an election worker and explain what you did and say, can I have a new ballot? Can you destroy this ballot and give me a new ballot? I meant to vote for my candidate of choice, and I made an X, and then I realized you're supposed to fill in the bubble, and I filled in the bubble, and then I realized this is going to come out as a spoiled ballot, and they'll work it out. There's a procedure, but they'll give you a new ballot. This person, not wanting to cause trouble, perhaps, had X'd the bubble near Gillespie, realized the mistake, filled in the bubble instead, proceeds to fill in all the rest of the bubbles for the rest of the Democratic candidates. But for some reason, after voting for governor and selecting the Republican, this is difficult to believe, then voting for lieutenant governor and selecting the correct bubble, and then attorney general and selecting the Republican bubble, and then the House of Delegates and selecting the wrong bubble all of a sudden, then moves on to Commonwealth's attorney, sheriff, commissioner of revenue, and treasurer for their county, filling in votes for Republicans all the way down, and then realizing, oh my goodness, or perhaps right after filling in for Simons, realizing, oh, that's the Democrat, not the Republican. They then fill in for Yancey and make a slash mark through Simons. Now, why not an X? Because this person reasons, oh no, an X is the mark that I thought would have been a valid vote when I first began this thing. I don't want to make that, but I will make an indication that I didn't mean to vote for this person. Again, if you get to that section and you've voted perfectly validly all the way down till you get to the House of Delegates and you fill in the wrong one, you got to stop and you got to talk to an election worker and say, I inadvertently filled in the wrong bubble for one of the races and I spoiled my ballot here. I need to start over. And they'll help you with it to the extent that they can. Also, I suppose it's possible that looking at the layout of the ballot, that this person was not voting in that order. And if you vote for the race in the top left corner first. Now, normally I go by ballot position. I think of it this way. The top race on the ballot is governor. The second race on the ballot is lieutenant governor. That box for the lieutenant governor's race appears directly underneath the governor's race. But there are three columns of races, and it's entirely possible they could have started at the top left and moved left to right, even though it's uneven. And but the race that's immediately to the right of the governor's race box is the House of Delegates, and they may have started making X's in Gillespie, and they started making an X in Simons, and then realized, no, I'm not supposed to make X's. I'm supposed to fill in the bubble. So they fill in the bubble for Simons, and then I say, I didn't even mean to vote for Simons at all. I meant to vote for Yancey, and besides which, I now have to go back and fill in the bubble for Gillespie. There are a couple of ways you could have gotten at it, I suppose. This is more time than I really intended to spend on this thing, but it just shows the various ways that you can come out on the try. This is why it's so difficult to try to determine voter outcome on a ballot that procedurally, sometimes it's just better to say, you know what, this is a spoiled ballot. The whole point of the last couple of minutes was this person began voting incorrectly and there was a remedy. And all you had to do is say, oops, I've done something wrong here. I realized it. Obviously, I think, unless it's just a total idiot that had no clue whatsoever what was going on. And it doesn't matter. I'm going to mark all over the place. I'm a moron. But you're supposed to go to the election workers and correct it. And if you don't, well, then that's pretty close to deciding not to bother with voting at all. Anyway, your ballot's spoiled. We can't try to figure out what this means. There's, even for this relatively simple spoiled ballot, and I've seen some real disasters out there that have marks all over the place, including written comments and circles and dots and paragraphs on the back of each one. But spoiled ballots spoiled. Sorry, we can't count this vote. But anyway, yeah, it's why it's better to just leave this aside. But they decided to try and discern a voice largely because the Democratic position in this. I mean, the Republicans agreed because it was helpful to them in this particular instance, but the Democratic position of, look, we really owe it to the voters to try and see if we can discern something. If there's just no sensible way we can interpret the ballot, then fine, it's spoiled. But if there's any way that's plausible, we should at least try it and see if the election judges buy it. So that's what they did, and Republicans said, aha, see, you want us to interpret this thing, so we're going to. Well, all right, maybe we lose on this one. Anyway, so where have we left off? The panel of judges agreed that with the Republican argument that all the other Republican names were filled in. This X mark is a little bit inexplicable, but we're going to count it for Republicans, and the judges agreed. Now, that leaves it tied. If Simons wins the seat, no matter how it happens, the House chamber gets split 50-50, and there's a power sharing arrangement, and there's all these stories that swirl around that one that Greg shared with us earlier. But of course, if Yancey wins, Republicans retain their majority by the slimmest possible margin, and then everything goes to hell. Now, in her motion, Simons asserts that the panel made a clear legal error that ran contrary to Virginia law by counting this disputed ballot. This is really about the integrity of elections in Virginia, she told reporters. She accused Yancey, a 6-year incumbent, of trying to do an end run around proper election procedures. Parker Slaybaugh, a spokesman for House Republicans, said nuh-uh in a statement, essentially saying the court acted appropriately and the integrity of the process is without question. The statement also noted that a recount in a separate House race involved a Democrat challenging a disputed ballot, which the court agreed to review and then counted for the Democratic candidate. In their letter to the Board of Elections, Simons' lawyer wrote that if the judges reconsider their finding that the contest was tied, there would be no need for a drawing. It also states that neither candidate would be harmed by a brief delay in naming a winner so long as the process is completed by the time that the General Assembly is gavelled into session on January 10th. If the race is still in limbo by that date, neither candidate would be seated, giving Republicans control of the chamber with 50 seats to the Democrats' 49. Clara Bell Wheeler, the lone Republican on the election board, said the matter should be settled before the legislature convenes. I am of the very strong opinion that the people of Newport News need to have a representative in the House of Delegates, she said. The last and perhaps only other time the state settled a tied election by lot was in 1971 when candidates for a House seat in Fairfax, Republican William H. Moss and Democrat Jim Birch, each received 16,410 votes. Virginia uses the same procedure several times a year to decide ballot order for candidates. So the randomness of how names will appear on the ballot is chosen by lot, and I guess that means they do have those film canisters at the ready at all times. That's good. They didn't have to search around for those. If there is a lot drawing in the 94th district race, the loser could seek a second recount. Wow, even that won't settle it. Democrats are also seeking a new election, by the way, in a different House race that Republican Bob Thomas won by 73 votes, in which an apparent voter registrar error led to 147 voters casting ballots in the wrong districts. You remember that one? We did bring that one up a few weeks ago. Katie Baker, a spokeswoman for the House Democrats, said Tuesday that the Democratic candidate in that race, Joshua Cole, will not contest the results with the state legislature, a last-ditch, rarely used measure. But Cole is still asking a federal judge to order a new election. It's actually probably less likely than getting the legislature to deal with it. A hearing is scheduled for January 5th. That's pretty late. His decision not to contest the election with the legislature was first reported by WTOP our local Washington area news radio station. Before the November 7th elections, Republicans outnumbered Democrats in the House 66-34. The GOP has a smaller 21-19 edge in the state Senate, where tied votes can be broken by the incoming Lieutenant Governor, Democrat Justin Fairfax. So, lots swirling around in all of that. But one additional point, just one more additional point that I would pull out of Greg's earlier discussion. Where was this article? We were reading about, remember could a split Virginia House force delegates to get along question. That also was a Washington Post article. Is it still open here? I don't think so. But it made a very interesting point here that I couldn't let lie for that long. There was at least two things in here that made me hearken back to the old federal legislature, the Congress. And one was, let's see, the issue of the talking filibuster. Remember when we were getting the history lesson of how closely divided houses of this Virginia state legislature ran, how they were run, and how political hardball tactics were frequently used or threatened to change the outcome of the votes. And it reminded me that, leaving people on the floor insisting on a talking filibuster would likewise enable some real hardball tactics and would require a lot of hard work. And I mean, you can't just walk away from the business on the floor and trust that it'll all go swimmingly while you're gone. You're going to have to stay there and earn your paycheck. But there was another interesting parallel to the federal legislature and my thinking about it. Where was this one? There was the situation right back in 1998 when, as they said, recently elected Republican Governor Jim Gilmore set the stage for the meltdown by plucking a handful of Democrats out of the legislature to take agency or cabinet positions, right? Northam has said he will avoid doing this, but there was still an issue, and Republicans won the open seats that were created by these appointments, bringing their total in the House to 49. With an independent delegate agreeing to caucus with them, that created a 50-50 split, the first time Democrats had lost sole power since the 1880s. And then this part, except that the three new Republican delegates had not yet been sworn in when Democrats convened the House to elect a speaker, a position that dictates committee assignments and legislative priorities, right? Parliamentary trickery ensued as both sides tried to gain the upper hand. That part, though, the three new Republican delegates hadn't been sworn in when Democrats convened the House, reminded me, of course, probably by now you've guessed what I'm thinking of the rather outlandish, but still, I think, entirely possible scenario at the beginning of this new Congress, a point at which the new members would have arrived to be sworn in both the Senate and the House, but at which then Vice President Joe Biden would still have had the gavel and would have been able to direct the proceedings of the Senate. Though we were awaiting the swearing in of Donald Trump and Mike Pence, it had not yet happened. The Congress being first to swear in and convene on January 3rd, the president not being sworn in until January 20th, there was an opportunity there for the presiding officer to direct things just a little bit differently. And what if the question of what to do with the still pending nomination of Merrick Garland were then brought before the Senate before any of the new senators, newly elected and re-elected senators, had been sworn in. And of course, we have since learned that the swearing-in ceremony really actually does mean a great deal in terms of whether or not the person in question can participate in the proceedings of the Senate or the House. Lots of people insisted that that was merely ceremonial, and it may yet be the case that some court might in the future rule that that is the case. But controlling law at the moment says the very opposite. And was it possible then for Vice President Joe Biden to have directed, not that he would have done it, not that he had the guts to do something quite this crazy, but could he have directed proceedings on the Senate floor such that the Merrick Garland nomination came up for a vote? Well, no sense in dreaming about it except here on this show where we can speculate endlessly for 2 hours, even though we need to take a break right now. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Time to move on, or at least partially move on, I think, from the topics that consumed the first hour and a half of the show. We did get a good mix of topics from Greg in the first hour, and we had to spend another half an hour obsessing about those things. But that's what we do on the show, and there's very little reason to argue with it at this point. Let's see, a few other things I think to clean up that Greg did bring up. Of course, there was the issue of whether or not Democrats were in fact divided or worried at all about the question of impeachment and whether or not it was going to consume a great deal of our time. I will note for the record here that the piece that Greg brought to our attention was illustrated with a photo of Jerry Nadler speaking to somebody. I don't know. Let's open it up. It was Politico. Didn't I open that one up? Yeah. So up at the top, let's see. What's the... it doesn't even really say where he was speaking. But Jerry Nadler is in the photo. Jerry Nadler now the chair of the House, or rather not the chair of the House Judiciary Committee, perhaps next year should the Democrats retake the majority, but he is the ranking minority member of the House Judiciary Committee. And it was a question that arose during the leadership race for the ranking member slot between Jerry Nadler and Zoe Lofgren. And I learned in reading about her background that she pronounces the name Zoe rather than Zoe. It's Z-O-E, and some people say Zoe. She says Zoe, apparently. Zoe Lofgren. And apparently that became an issue of sorts as between them. It was a very cordial race, but it was generally supposed for some reason that Nadler was the more, let's say, favorably imposed toward impeachment as a possibility than Lofgren. And I don't know that it would be accurate to say that Lofgren is anti-impeachment. I doubt that very much. It's just that I guess it was a little less central to her thinking than it was to Nadler. I don't know whether that's an accurate portrayal of where they stood, but that's how it got portrayed, and I think that might be how it filtered down to the rank and file membership of the House Democratic Caucus when they were voting. But a point that I was trying to make a week ago, more than a week ago, how long ago did we do it? These races are very rarely decided ideologically, or at least the ideology is very rarely a better predictor of the outcome of the races, even if they are decided based on ideology. A long-running theme for me, both on the show and prior to the show, is that these things tend to be decided, or at least are better predicted by how much money has been donated by each of the two leadership candidates through their leadership PACs to other Democrats in the House Democratic Caucus. And, I mean, that's a phenomenon that's, been around since forever, but it was a great explainer or great explanation for the outcome of the Hoyer-Murtha race for majority leader, as between Steny Hoyer, who had been pretty supportive of the Iraq War, but had spent years distributing far more money in the form of donations through a leadership PAC to members of the House Democratic Caucus, than had Jack Murtha, who had been an Iraq War critic from an earlier date. Not initially, but from an earlier date. And so there was some real question about whether or not retaking the majority in the House at this critical point in 2006, after the 2006 elections, were Democrats going to put forward a majority leader who was still largely a supporter of the Iraq War versus someone who had been an earlier critic and who had a military background at that, so a stronger position possibly from which to criticize? Were they going to put him in charge of essentially what they hoped was setting the ideological and political agenda for Democrats in the House? And the answer was no, they didn't. They opted not to, and they opted for Steny Hoyer instead. And the only explanation for it was, given the ideological tenor in the caucus at the time, was, well, Hoyer's done a lot more favors for a lot more of us, and really the true nature of the majority leader job is to build and maintain that majority, not to set our ideological direction. And we don't really actually want the majority leader to set that as a primary function of leadership anyway. Maybe they want that in the Republican conference, but in the Democratic caucus, we tend to shy away from that. And so the money predicted the race much better than the ideology. The ideology was not as sharply divided here in this race. And of course, it wasn't as high profile a race. It wasn't even for a chairmanship. It might turn into one if Democrats retake the House, but for the moment, it's just the ranking member position, and it doesn't carry that much weight. And there's not that much daylight between Nadler and Lofgren on most issues of importance. But I reminded you that money would likely determine the outcome. And again, the very best measure, the most accurate thing I guess I could think of in terms of figuring out whether the money will be predictive here is you'd really want to look at each individual donation that the super PAC made, or the leadership PAC made, and see what happened to that candidate. In other words, $100,000 donated to candidates who all lost probably isn't as powerful in determining the outcome of this race as $10,000 donated to candidates who won, because the candidates who lost are not there to cast votes as members of the Democratic caucus, obviously. But that makes it a very difficult task, tracking down each of these things, because you really want to look at the lifetime of giving from leadership PACs. And some members, by the way, maintain more than one leadership PAC as well, but these two had only one. But you want to look at how much money they've given over the life of the PAC, not just in the last cycle, because, people will remember favors that you did for them before the last year. Not always as well as you wish they would remember them, but usually. So lifetime giving is the better metric. The best metric, of course, like I said, tracking down each one of those donations and seeing what happens to those candidates. Did they win? Are they still there now to cast that vote? That's another problem. You could have given money to lots of people who won, but they have since retired, and they're not around to cast votes either. Anyway, long story short, I looked at the lifetime giving. The last election cycle was very heavily in favor of Lofgren. In fact, the current election cycle, very heavily in favor of Lofgren. In the 2018 election cycle, Lofgren has given $73,500 from her leadership PAC to various Democrats. Nadler, only $35,000. So you would think there the edge goes to Lofgren. In the 2016 cycle, Lofgren likewise far outpaces Nadler. And I worried that we had things backwards here now that we knew the outcome, that Nadler won. In the 2016 election cycle, Lofgren gave $87,500 to fellow Democrats. Nadler gave only $7,000. That's amazing. She's blowing them out of the water, right? Well, things do quickly reverse. Not that quickly. In 2014, she gave $32,500 to fellow Democrats. Nadler just behind her there, $30,000. But he's still far behind, right? 2012, $13,674, not an even figure this time. 2012, That was Lofgren's disbursements to fellow Democrats from her leadership PAC. $20,500 from Nadler. Still not looking too good for Nadler, who did win this race, right? And therefore not looking particularly good for my theory that these things are better predicted by the money. Here's where we run into a problem. Zoe Lofgren's leadership PAC disbursements in the year 2010. $0. There was no Zoe Lofgren leadership PAC in the 2010 election cycle, apparently. Likewise, of course, no 2008 election cycle donations from Zoe Lofgren's leadership PAC. 0 and 0. For a grand total of $207,174 given lifetime to date that we know of in terms of donations that have been reported anyway, from Zoe Lofgren's leadership PAC, $207,174. So here's the issue. In the 2010 and 2008 election cycles, when there was no Zoe Lofgren PAC, what was Jerry Nadler's leadership PAC doing? Well, in 2010, he was busy giving out an additional $29,000. Still, he's way behind, right? Well, 2008 was a banner year for him, and I suppose you could say, well, what about the old saying, "What have you done for me lately?" issue? Because, in that case, Lofgren wins going away, right? Well, it was a big year, 2008, $118,500 given away by Jerry Nadler in the 2008 cycle. And I can't really account for the dropping numbers since then. And I wonder what the hell was going on. But I don't know. I mean, he may have been redistricted slightly at some point. Perhaps that had something to do with it. But in the end, the question is, I had posited that lifetime totals would be more predictive of the outcome, even if they weren't the only, even if they didn't have anything to do with the motivations behind how you cast the ballots. $207,174 for Lofgren lifetime. Nadler lifetime, $240,000 even. There you go. 240 to 207. The prediction would have to be Nadler for the ranking member seat, and so it went. Now, the question of whether or not members of the Democratic caucus thought back to 2008 and said, yeah, now, Lofgren, she did give me a lot of money last year, and she just gave me another big check. And the year before that, in fact, she gave me a pretty big check. But back in 2008, Jerry Nadler gave me a pretty nice check. Yeah. And I mean, these checks don't exceed $5,000, so it's not like it was this stunning thing. It's just, one wonders. I think there's a lot motivating how these things go. And ideology really does play some role in it. It has to. People definitely consider it. And it's a lot easier to believe and understand that ideology might, in fact, be determinative if you haven't gotten money from Jerry Nadler in almost 10 years and have gotten 2 nice checks in the last 2 cycles from Zoe Lofgren. It's hard to believe that you would go back and say, well, yeah, she gave me $10,000, but Jerry Nadler gave me $10,001 10 years ago. I doubt that very much. But again, this isn't supposed to tell you why people vote the way they do necessarily, but just that money is a bigger player in all of this, and money is a better predictor of all of this, even if it doesn't actually explain voting behavior necessarily all by itself. So far, the model holds. That's the upshot of the last 15 minutes. I just thought I would bring you up to date on that. And it's worth thinking about what all of this will mean in the next Congress, if in fact Democrats do take over. That will be, of course, the bigger and more important question than how can we guess in the 4 days before we figure out who's really going to win this contest, who has the greatest likelihood of doing so. But it's a nice parlor game anyway. Okay, let's see if we can work through the background coughing and get on to a few other stories here. Here's something I'll share with you that I will unfortunately have to admit to you came to me on Twitter via Eric Garland, game theory guy. I do not follow Eric Garland, but I don't block him and I don't filter him out either. And somebody else must have retweeted him into my timeline. And I find it valuable to monitor what he is going on about. And it's a good idea of the general direction that the news cycle about the Trump-Russia investigation is going to take, even if I don't necessarily buy his take on everything. Anyway, doesn't matter. He didn't write this article. He was merely retweeting a BuzzFeed piece from Chris Hamby, which I find interesting, and I want to share with you, not so much because I necessarily believe the premise of the article is 100% true and it means what we're meant to imply that it means from the headline and hair on fire lead. But the fact that you have to consider this at all is interesting and indicative of how much work we have to do in order to have any hope of securing our own election integrity before the 2018 election cycle and going on into the future. This is a little alarming. Chris Hamby's piece is titled, FBI Software for Analyzing Fingerprints Contains Russian-Made Code, Whistleblowers Say. Now, again, it's not automatically the case that this is something to panic about or that there's something nefarious going on, but in the interest of election integrity and knowing what we know now about the abilities of hackers in general and the motivation of Russian hackers, well, we're going to have someone check this out. The sub-header here sums things up in case I should talk my way to the end of the show without getting through the article. In a secret deal, a French company purchased code from a Kremlin-connected firm, incorporated it into its own software, and you could see how that might happen less than nefariously. I mean, they say a secret deal, but most deals are probably relatively secret. They don't necessarily announce every deal they make to the public, these companies. So they purchased code from a Kremlin-connected firm, incorporated it into its own software, and hid its existence, though, from the FBI, according to documents and 2 whistleblowers. The allegations raised concerns that Russian hackers could compromise law enforcement computer systems. That would be bad, wouldn't it? Especially if, for instance, the current line in Russian trollery was to either prompt or simply respond to and build on and feed upon Donald Trump's disparaging of the FBI and claims of FBI bias. Suppose, for instance, in all of this in the background, that you could, let's say, plant evidence of so-called FBI bias. Wouldn't that be helpful to your trollery? Here's the actual report here. We'll take it for what it's worth. The fingerprint analysis software used by the FBI and more than 18,000 other U.S. law enforcement agencies contains code created by a Russian firm with close ties to the Kremlin, according to documents and 2 whistleblowers. Now, that sounds terrible because Kremlin, yikes. As a matter of fact, we can even add music to that. Kremlin, yikes. Well, you know, I'm not overreacting. You should think that when you hear Kremlin. It can't be the case that we play that every time. Thank God, here's where we thank God that we don't actually have a production staff, because if we did, we'd get into a situation where somebody would think it was hilarious every time I said Kremlin. A guy who wasn't me would press the button and I'd be like, okay, that's enough. Haha, very funny. Don't do it every time I say Kremlin now, because, but if you're doing the show all by yourself, you have no one to blame but yourself. And so we miss out on a lot of comedy, I suppose, in that way. But on the other hand, if you didn't think that was funny, you're probably happy that we don't have outside production. Okay. But seriously, that sounds terrible because Kremlin, and you're not supposed to trust the Kremlin. But, you know, as we mentioned briefly in yesterday's show, we're recalling that earlier in the year, I just thought, I was among the many people who thought it's just dumb and outdated to worry so much about what, is happening just because Kremlin or whatever. Isn't that an outdated way of thinking of the Russians? And it turns out that it might not have been. It may have been okay to think that way 10 years ago, but since then, and really since the rise to power of Vladimir Putin, it's been probably a mistake, and it's one we've made for far too long. Anyway, but it sounds terrible, and maybe it could be more innocent. For instance, like I'm now finding out, we've mentioned a couple times on the show, Kaspersky antivirus. Presumably a pretty decent product, one that I had on my PCs anyway, because when I bought them at Best Buy, because I'm such a discerning consumer of computers and electronics, and I get all, I get all the best stuff from only the most amazing boutique creators, right? I went to Best Buy. I needed a PC. I got it. That was what they recommended for antivirus, and it seemed to do a pretty good job. My computers froze up and broke down with malware less frequently. So good, right? Kaspersky, it never really occurred to me, like, who's Kaspersky? He's a Russian immigrant. He's a person his family's been in America for 4 generations. Just the name is Russian in origin. They never changed it. And so, fine, right? No. Oh, he's still Russian? Oh, well, okay, that's something. Oh, okay. Russians are hacking computers, but not Kaspersky. They're against hacking computers, right? That's what the company is. They're not Kremlin connected. Oh, wait, everybody is Kremlin connected? Anybody who's anybody and has any amount of money basically has to be Kremlin connected, or otherwise it wouldn't be Kaspersky's antivirus we were using here in the United States. It would be some other Russian who, was doing probably favors on the side for the Kremlin in order to get the export licenses and the export-import bank equivalent backing to break into the American market. I don't really know whether any of that happened, but it's entirely possible. And so now later on, of course, we find out, there really are suspicions that the Kaspersky antivirus is not necessarily your best friend, even with respect to finding routine malware on your computer. And it may be because they're Russian in general and connected in some way to the Kremlin, or certainly have to keep one eye on staying in the favor of the Kremlin, and so that raises suspicions. But I guess that means that you could say, I too have software on my computer secretly that was created by a Russian firm with close ties to the Kremlin. It's true. So the FBI could have come by it in a similar way. Not that the French colluded it in some way with Russians to sneak this stuff in, but that rather, they made a deal. They bought a patch for their software from a Russian programming house, and to all appearances, it was on the level and did what they needed to do. And they didn't feel any particular need to disclose it to their customers in general, because it was just a software patch. Who cares where it got programmed and by whom? Does it work is the question. And do we really need to have country of origin labeling for software? Well, I guess we probably do now. And then it may also very well be the case that the FBI is among many thousands of customers for this software, and the French-owned company feels no particular compunction about telling everybody where its patches came from. And, one of our customers is the FBI. And sure, they're probably going to think about, in hindsight, yes, we probably should have informed them. But, was there an active program of hiding it? I don't know. We'll see what the article says. But it's just interesting, is all I can say. The allegations raise concerns that Russian hackers could gain backdoor access to sensitive biometric information on millions of Americans, or compromise wider national security and law enforcement computer systems. Of course, at this point in the article, we must remind ourselves it could be said that that's the case, or it could be said that none of that is particularly possible, or anything, even a remote possibility, or any kind of threat whatsoever, because the people who did the programming just wanted to make a patch that worked and get home for the day and didn't do any of this stuff. But you gotta wonder, That's our job now. The Russian code was inserted into the fingerprint analysis software by a French company, said the two whistleblowers who are former employees of that company. The firm, then a subsidiary of the massive Paris-based conglomerate Safran, deliberately concealed from the FBI the fact that it had purchased the Russian code in a secret deal, they said. Now, another thing that I guess could be happening, and you got to wonder about this stuff, is are the former employees of Safran themselves, by any chance, Russian? You just wonder, like, or were they fired by Russian-born bosses and they're angry at them? Or is this all a story they made up, or what? Yeah, things have to be checked out. In recent years, the story continues, Russian hackers have gained access to everything from the Democratic National Committee's email servers to the systems of nuclear power companies to the unclassified computers of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, according to U.S. authorities. This September, the Department of Homeland Security ordered all federal agencies to stop using products made by the Moscow-based company Kaspersky Lab, including its popular antivirus software. And media outlets reported that Russian hackers had exploited it, Kaspersky that is, to steal sensitive information on U.S. intelligence programs. The department later clarified that the order didn't apply to Kaspersky code embedded in the products of other companies. That's the issue. The company's founder, Eugene V. Kaspersky, has denied any involvement in or knowledge of the hack. The Russian company, whose code ended up in the FBI fingerprint analysis software, has Kremlin connections that should raise similar national security concerns, said the whistleblowers, both French nationals who worked in Russia. The Russian company, Papillon AO, that's what it says, boasts in its own publications about its close cooperation with various Russian ministries, as well as the Federal Security Service, the intelligence agency known as the FSB, that is a successor to the Soviet-era KGB and has been implicated in other hacks of U.S. targets. Now, what does that mean? That could just simply mean that among its marketing materials, the company says, why, we're so good at our job that even the Russian Federal Security Service uses our work, which would ordinarily tend to suggest that you did highly secure stuff, because of course they're interested in security. On the other hand, who knows what it might imply? Cybersecurity experts said the danger of using the Russian-made code could be assessed without examining the code itself, but the fact that there were connections to the FSB would make me nervous to use this software, said Tim Evans, who worked as Director of Operational Policy for the National Security Agency's elite cyber intelligence unit known as Tailored Access Operations, and now helps run the cybersecurity firm Adlumin. I don't know what that company is all about. I don't know whether they're any good. I don't know whether we need to trust them. I don't know whether we need to panic. I do know that we're nearly out of time for consideration of this story, but I wanted to bring it to your attention, and you can and should absolutely take the opportunity to review the article and read the balance of it and see whether you think it outlines a threat worthy of consideration. But I really brought it up mostly to raise the scary, scary point that perhaps we ought to be considering every entry point possible of Russian hacking and coding into our daily lives. And I would suggest we would probably find it rather quickly very overwhelming. But again, imagine the scenario posited here in which it gave the Russian FSB access to law enforcement computers system-wide. If at the same time that they were paying people to implant in Donald Trump's mind the idea that the FBI was hopelessly biased in favor of, Hillary Clinton and against Donald Trump, and that meme began to penetrate on Fox News, which it is, of course, doing right now, and there were also calls for investigation of that bias throughout the FBI, and lo and behold, emails or other electronic records began to surface from the FBI, which purported to be messages from active agents that exhibited this very same bias imagine what problems that could cause for the Mueller investigation. And what if we didn't know whether those messages were genuine or had been planted there through a back door? Yikes.
From Daily Kos Radio on networksradio.com. You have been listening to the Kagro in the Morning Show
with David Waldman.
Well, I ate up most of the time, but do stay tuned as always for the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy Dailies special. Today's Smothered Benedict Wednesdays, and amazing rack of stories they've got here, including a clip of Republican Representative Francis Rooney being a useful idiot, at least. That's always fun. Stay tuned for Justice next.